1 in 3 got through. That is the number sitting at the center of everything that happened in the pre-dawn hours over northern Israel. Not the volume of the attack, not the scale of the response, the ratio. 300 rockets and loitering munitions launched by Hezbollah in a compressed window. 200 intercepted, 100 reached their targets, 1 in 3. For more than a decade, Iron Dome was elevated to something close to sacred in Western military thinking. A near-impenetrable shield. The system that rescued Israeli civilian life from wave after wave of fire out of Gaza. The model that Western partners studied, exported, and held up as proof that technology could defeat the mathematics of mass attack. Defense ministries across the alliance built doctrine around that mythology. Last night, Hezbollah stress-tested that mythology against its own physical limits. And 1 in 3 is what the physics answered back. This is not a story about a bad night. This is a story about a threshold being crossed. A system that hits its ceiling in combat does not bounce back the next morning. It reveals what happens to every strategic calculation built on the assumption that the ceiling did not exist. And in Israel's case, the strategic calculations built on Iron Dome's mythology are the foundations of its civil resilience model, its economic continuity planning, and its assumption that a northern front could be managed while the southern one was being fought. All 3 of those foundations just took direct hits. I'm going to walk you through exactly how Hezbollah engineered this breakthrough, what it costs in dollars every single hour that Israel runs its defense at this tempo, why the strategic vice is tightening from 2 directions simultaneously, and what the silence of Washington, Moscow, and Beijing in the background of all of this actually means. Because what happened over northern Israel last night is not a regional military story. It is a financial story and a geopolitical story disguised as a military one, and the financial dimension is the most alarming part that mainstream coverage is not fully explaining. How you break a system that cannot be broken. Hezbollah did not attempt to overwhelm Iron Dome through sheer volume alone. That approach has been tried. It produces high intercept rates and manageable leakage. What Hezbollah deployed instead was something considerably more sophisticated. A tactical architecture specifically engineered around Iron Dome's operational logic rather than against its raw capacity. The opening move, saturation from multiple simultaneous launch positions, when hundreds of signals appear on a radar display at the same moment, originating from different vectors across complex terrain, the control system faces a data processing problem that has a physical solution time. The radar must track, the targeting algorithm must prioritize, the intercept batteries must engage. Each of those steps takes time measured in fractions of a second. And when the inbound count is high enough, the fraction starts to matter. But the more important move was the layering. Hezbollah fed older, low-cost unguided rockets into the swarm as decoys, not because those rockets were expected to penetrate, because they were expected to force the system to spend $40,000 to $50,000 interceptor missiles burning through its inventory at maximum rate, depleting the magazine while attention was locked on the upper trajectory band. Woven through and beneath that upper layer, UAVs, small, low-altitude, terrain-hugging trajectories that exploit the topographic complexity of northern Lebanon's ridgelines. Minimal radar cross-sections. No acoustic signature that distinguishes them from ambient noise at distance. These platforms navigated between the seams of early warning coverage, approaching at angles that point defense systems were not positioned to engage cleanly. And here is the tactical concept that should alarm every defense analyst reading after-action assessments this morning. Evidence has emerged suggesting specific UAV missions were targeted against Iron Dome launcher batteries at the moment of their firing cycle. When a launcher activates to fire an interceptor, it reveals its position. Hezbollah understood that. The act of defending became the vulnerability. The shield was being used to locate the shield's components. 100 projectiles reaching their targets across Safed, Kiryat Shmona, and surrounding communities was not statistical noise from a large salvo. It was the output of a tactical formula designed to produce exactly that number by exploiting the computational limits of the system defending against it. In Safed and the surrounding communities, residents spent the night in shelters as the distinction between warning siren and explosion collapsed into a continuous roar. Military installations, power infrastructure, and civilian areas registered hits. The morning revealed what the night had accomplished. Iron Dome had not failed. It had reached its ceiling. And reaching a ceiling in a war that is not over is not a recoverable position when the adversary that found the ceiling can replicate the formula. What Hezbollah actually is in 2026. Anyone still carrying the image of Hezbollah as a guerrilla organization firing unguided rockets into open fields is operating on a threat assessment that was outdated before this conflict began and is now terminally wrong. What unfolded over northern Israel was not an irregular force conducting harassment operations. It was a structured warfare architecture executed with the discipline of a conventional military that has internalized an asymmetric mindset at every operational level. The organization that Iran has been equipping, training, and embedding with precision guidance technology for the past decade is not the Hezbollah of 2006. It is something qualitatively different. The defining shift in this strike package was the prominent role of precision-guided munitions. Hezbollah has now mastered systems comparable to the Fateh 110 family and its domestically adapted variants. These are not steel tubes fired with statistical intent. They are guided attack instruments equipped with navigation systems and terminal seekers capable of accuracy measured in single-digit meters. That precision changes the fundamental character of what Hezbollah can accomplish. Targets are no longer broad zones selected to generate mass panic. The targeting has shifted to high-value nodes with critical tactical significance: radar surveillance stations, air defense launcher sites, military data centers, command infrastructure distributed across northern Israel. A precision munition locked onto one of those forces the defensive system to respond at maximum priority, burning through its most valuable assets to protect its most critical infrastructure. Hezbollah understands that logic and exploits it without hesitation. The integration of precision rockets with loitering munitions has produced a complete operational ecosystem that Israel has not faced at this level of sophistication and synchronization. This is swarm warfare in its mature form. A synthesis of volume, precision, and coordination, generating pressure exceeding the processing capacity of a fixed defensive architecture. And then there is the timing dimension, which is the most strategically revealing element of the entire operation. Hezbollah did not open this phase randomly. It chose this specific moment because Israel's force distribution is already under compounding strain from 36 days of the Iran conflict. Opening a full-scale northern front at precisely the moment of maximum dispersal generates a resource prioritization problem that does not have a clean solution. Elite units oriented toward deeper operational objectives have been forced to pivot north, extending the defensive line from the Mediterranean coast to the Golan Plateau. What that fragmentation creates is the kind of distributed vulnerability that a sophisticated adversary can probe for the one seam that, exposed at the wrong moment, becomes an irreversible disadvantage. This is not purely a military strike. It is a strategic stress test, a message to Washington simultaneously. Any escalatory move against Iran's extended network will be paid for in Israeli security, in real time through the northern front. $50,000 every few seconds. Here is where the military story becomes a financial story. And the financial story is worse than the military one. A single Tamar interceptor, the core munition of Iron Dome, costs between $40,000 and $50,000. To achieve reliable kill probability against an incoming threat, Israeli doctrine typically requires 2 interceptors per target. That means each successful interception costs approximately $100,000. On the other side of that exchange, a Katyusha variant or comparable Hezbollah munition costs roughly $300 to $500 to produce. This is not a gap. This is a structural asymmetry that defines an attrition dynamic with a nearly predetermined outcome when sustained over time. Hezbollah fires a $500 rocket. Israel fires $100,000 worth of response. The exchange ratio is 200 to 1 in Hezbollah's favor on pure cost arithmetic. In last night's salvo of 300 incoming projectiles, Hezbollah expended somewhere under $150,000. Israel burned through approximately $15 million in interceptor costs in a matter of hours, and that figure covers only the Tamar missiles, not logistics, not operational overhead, not the secondary economic damage from the approximately 100 projectiles that broke through. A rocket costing $500 that destroys a power substation triggers millions of dollars in cascading infrastructure damage. That same $500 rocket that displaces a community of 10,000 people from their homes generates housing support costs, relocation subsidies, social stability maintenance, and lost economic productivity that compound over weeks and months. The kinetic cost of the incoming projectile is trivial. The systemic cost downstream is orders of magnitude larger. Iron Dome, conceived as a strategic shield, is being systematically converted into a resource consumption engine. Hezbollah maintains a continuous offensive rhythm at a tempo just sufficient to generate maximum defensive response without overextending its own operational capacity. Israel is locked into a state of permanent maximum readiness defense. 24 hours per day, every radar signal triggering a response. every response draining the account. As interceptor reserves decline, Israel becomes progressively more dependent on American resupply pipelines. But Washington's capacity is not unlimited, particularly as it balances simultaneous commitments across the Iran conflict itself. Every congressional appropriations debate over military aid carries political friction that creates indirect strategic leverage for Hezbollah and Iran without them having to spend a single additional dollar generating it. The budget argument in Washington is a battle they don't fight. The American political system fights it for them. Israel's economic model carries a structural vulnerability that compounds all of this. The reserve mobilization system pulls tens of thousands of workers from civilian roles and deploys them into an active combat environment. That displacement removes productive economic capacity from national output, suppressing growth and tax revenues simultaneously while increasing state expenditure at every line item. Northern community displacement generates housing support requirements, relocation subsidies, and social stability costs that expand as the conflict extends. The financial siege is running in parallel to the kinetic one. Israel now faces a decision matrix with no favorable branch. Sustaining the current defensive posture means accepting slow financial attrition across an indeterminate timeline. Pursuing a ground offensive into Lebanon to eliminate the threat at its source means entering terrain that Hezbollah has spent years converting specifically into an environment designed to maximize attacker attrition. Tunnel networks extending dozens of kilometers, fortified firing positions, anti-tank ambush corridors pre-registered to every approach route. Modern precision air power and fifth-generation aircraft cannot neutralize a tunnel network. Laser-guided munitions cannot destroy a human network that dissolves into terrain between activation windows. Each intercept runs $100,000. The clock is running, and neither path out of this geometry is priced at anything approaching acceptable. The vice, closing from two directions. If the battlefield is a chess match where every move is paid for in blood and capital, Israel currently occupies the most dangerous positional disadvantage it has faced since the Yom Kippur War of 1973. The military doctrine calls it multi-front warfare. The ground reality is harsher than that terminology implies. From the south, pressure from Gaza, remnants and Houthi forces in Yemen sustains a continuous drain on attention and assets. From the north, Hezbollah has emerged as a fully constituted fighting entity, resilient, adaptive, and operating at a lethality level that has permanently reclassified its threat tier. Israel can no longer concentrate its full mass of force against a single adversary of its choosing. The foundational advantage that has historically defined IDF operations, speed, precision, the ability to mass firepower rapidly at a decisive point, is being systematically diluted by a conflict architecture deliberately designed to deny exactly that. Hezbollah's mass salvo was not purely kinetic. It was a direct attack on Israel's strategic nervous system. Elite units oriented toward deeper objectives were forced to pivot and reinforce the Lebanon border, extending the defensive line and fragmenting response capacity across a front that now runs from the Mediterranean coastline to the Golan Plateau. One exposed seam at the wrong moment is an irreversible advantage for the adversary that finds it. The Houthi dimension adds the maritime layer that completes the encirclement geometry. Operating with upgraded Iranian-origin ballistic missiles and maritime attack drones, Houthi forces have continued degrading commercial shipping through the Red Sea corridor, forcing major carriers to divert or suspend operations entirely. This is not peripheral harassment. It is a coordinated economic strangulation line operating in geographic synchronization with Hezbollah's northern pressure and the sustained Iran conflict. A multi-layered attack framework in which Hezbollah degrades Israel's military capacity through attrition, the Houthis apply economic pressure through maritime disruption, and Iran provides the strategic coordination binding the entire structure into a coherent campaign. This is a model of integrated warfare that Israel has not faced at this scale or this level of synchronization across its history. The silence that is its own message. Behind the walls of fire tearing across the Middle East, the world's major powers have settled into a composure that borders on unsettling. Ceasefire appeals circulate through diplomatic channels and UN podiums with the regularity of a scheduled broadcast. But they exist as language, not as action. No decisive intervention follows. No enforcement mechanism activates. This silence is not indifference. It is calculated strategic patience from three directions simultaneously, each with its own geometry. Washington is navigating a genuine dilemma: how to sustain the commitment to Israeli security while avoiding entanglement in a full-spectrum conflict against Iran. an adversary that has demonstrated strategic endurance far exceeding original Western projections. American planners understand that direct deep engagement on two simultaneous fronts could trigger the precise economic detonation that most threatens the domestic political foundation. Energy prices. A full Strait of Hormuz disruption scenario, combined with an active northern front generating its own energy infrastructure damage, could drive crude to levels that cascade through American consumer prices and generate political headwinds with no clean exit. Washington's posture is therefore calibrated at the boundary between deterrence and restraint, present, visible, not fully committed to the vortex. The implicit signal in that posture is one every government in the region is reading. Unconditional backing has upper limits when weighed against total strategic cost. Moscow observes with the composed patience of an actor that recognizes regional turmoil in the Middle East, relieves pressure in other theaters simultaneously. When Western attention and resources are absorbed into the Eastern Mediterranean crisis, the distribution of strategic focus shifts in ways that benefit Russian positioning elsewhere. The Kremlin does not require direct involvement. The conflict's gravitational pull on Western capacity is itself the outcome Moscow finds most useful. Beijing maintains its characteristically flexible public non-alignment while making deeply pragmatic calculations underneath. For China, the Middle East is a critical node in energy supply chains and trade route architecture that underpins Chinese economic growth. The Chinese silence is preparatory positioning for the future moment when reconstruction need, energy stabilization, and investment opportunity converge, when economic leverage and capital deployment will generate influence more durable than any military insertion could produce. Quiet accumulation of strategic positioning while others exhaust themselves is a model Beijing has refined across decades. The simultaneous silence of three powers, driven by entirely different calculations, produces a fragile equilibrium, the equilibrium of intersecting interests where no party is willing to cross the threshold that triggers direct superpower confrontation, but none is willing to impose the intervention that would stop the existing one. That equilibrium is inherently unstable. Its existence permits this conflict to continue without an effective ceiling, the worst case that nobody wants to name. Here is the trajectory that every government in the region is privately modeling and publicly refusing to describe. Israel's war cabinet, watching defensive capacity being progressively ground down across two simultaneous fronts while interceptor reserves decline and financial attrition compounds, reaches the threshold of strategic impatience. Armored brigades roll north into Lebanon with the declared intent of eliminating Hezbollah's launch infrastructure at its source. The terrain is not accommodating. Complex topography, an extensive tunnel network refined over years, an ambush doctrine honed against exactly this type of operation will convert technological advantage into irrelevance. Anti-tank missiles wait inside every prepared firing position. The most sophisticated armored vehicles on Earth become burning wreckage. This war would not be won through speed or firepower. It would be paid for in personnel attrition across a grinding, indeterminate timeline. As Israel is drawn into that attritional trap, Iran executes the response it has been holding in reserve. Strait of Hormuz closure, not the soft closure of the past 36 days, but a declared, enforced, naval-mined, cruise missile-backed hard closure that transforms the most critical energy choke point on Earth into a denied zone. Global oil markets react instantly. Prices breach levels without modern precedent. Economies across Europe and East Asia, operating on thin margin assumptions, face inflationary shocks with no short-term remedy. Social stability mechanisms in multiple countries come under pressure simultaneously. This is not a regional military move. It is a strike against the structural foundation of the global economy, and it is the most potent deterrence instrument Iran holds in reserve. As the scenario reaches its upper register, Hezbollah intensifies from the north. Houthi forces lock down southern maritime corridors. Iranian-aligned networks in Syria and Iraq activate along a strategic arc that encircles Israel from multiple approach angles. Under that combined pressure, the decision calculus in Tel Aviv begins approaching the contingency that has never been formally acknowledged but has shaped Israeli strategic doctrine for decades. If that threshold is crossed, the Middle East is no longer a conflict theater. It becomes a zone of long-duration devastation whose geographic scope of contamination cannot be bounded by any military planner who has ever written an honest wargame. 3 paths from the Northern Front scenario. 1. Containment holds at current tempo. Israel absorbs the financial attrition of the defensive posture, $100,000 per intercept, the northern front at sustained intensity, while American resupply pipelines maintain interceptor inventory above critical thresholds. Hezbollah achieves its goal of dispersing Israeli force and imposing ongoing cost without triggering the ground operation it has spent years preparing to receive. The key indicator, the weekly interceptor resupply announcement from the U.S. Department of Defense. If resupply rates are keeping pace with expenditure, this scenario is sustainable. If the resupply language becomes accelerated or emergency priority, the inventory gap is real and the scenario is degrading. Scenario 2. Israel goes north. The combination of financial attrition, interceptor depletion, and the political pressure of civilian casualties in the north forces a ground decision. Israeli armored and infantry units cross the Lebanese border with the stated objective of destroying Hezbollah's launch infrastructure at source. The key indicator, any Israeli Homefront Command announcement expanding civilian evacuation zones in the north beyond current parameters. That announcement is the pre-operational signal. The evacuation precedes the offensive by 24 to 72 hours. Scenario 3. The vice closes. The two-front pressure, combined with the Houthi maritime campaign and the Iran conflict itself, exceeds Israel's resource allocation capacity. A diplomatic framework for the northern front separate from the Iran ceasefire being negotiated through Pakistan becomes necessary. Hezbollah does not negotiate directly with Israel. It negotiates through Lebanon, through France, through Qatar. The key indicator, any French or Qatari diplomatic communication referencing stabilization of the Lebanese front as a distinct track from the Iran ceasefire process. That language means a parallel negotiation has opened and Hezbollah has agreed to participate. What to watch? The interceptor resupply rate. Not the battlefield footage, not the strike communiques, the logistical numbers. RTX Corporation's Tamir production acceleration rate versus the current expenditure rate. If the gap between consumption and replenishment is widening, the defensive posture is degrading in a direction that produces a forced decision within weeks rather than months. The northern civilian displacement count. The moment northern Israeli communities begin evacuating at scale beyond the current shelter-in-place posture, it signals the government has assessed the threat as exceeding what the current defensive architecture can contain at acceptable casualty rates. The superpower language. Watch for any shift in Washington's public posture from "we support Israel's right to defend itself" to "we urge de-escalation on all fronts." That second phrase is the signal that Washington has privately concluded the northern front has exceeded the threshold of what American commitment can absorb alongside the Iran conflict. And watch the financial markets. Not just crude. Israeli bond yields and the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange are the most honest real-time indicators of how Israel's institutional investors are assessing the sustainability of this military posture. If Israeli bonds start pricing a duration premium that wasn't there before last night, the financial markets have reached their own conclusion about the timeline of the current trajectory. 1 in 3 got through. That ratio is the verdict on a decade of mythology built around a system that performed extraordinarily well until it met an adversary that had spent years mapping its operational ceiling. Hezbollah found the ceiling. The ceiling is real. And now every strategic calculation that was built on the assumption that the ceiling did not exist has to be rebuilt from a different foundation. The financial trap underneath is running at $100,000 per intercept, 24 hours a day, with no ceiling of its own in sight. The vice is tightening from 2 directions simultaneously, while 3 major powers watch from calculated distance. And the worst-case trajectory that nobody wants to describe in public is the one that every planning document in every relevant capital is privately modeling. The Middle East is not a story that belongs to one country or one region. It touches energy pricing, supply chain integrity, and the financial security of households on every continent. This is the defining stress test of a global system navigating its most turbulent transition in decades. The circuit breaker has not yet activated. Watch whether it does.